so eager here, even before me, filling up the room. That's cool. I'm flattered. Thank you. My name is Jeff Fritz. I'm a program manager for Microsoft on the ASP.NET teams. I work on that thing called web forms you may have heard of, you may have used over the past 15 years. And I also do a bit of developer outreach, all right, trying to help spread a little bit more information about the new ASP.NET Core platform. Now, before I get into the talk, I want to kind of take the temperature here. Who's been using ASP.NET Core? Who's been using ASP.NET 5? Okay, who knows the difference between the two? Okay, the fact that those people who said they're using ASP.NET Core weren't the people who raised their hands and said, I'm using ASP.NET, I know the difference between the two, tells me a little something. So let me define a couple things here first. We released ASP.NET 4.6 and something that we called ASP.NET 5 last July with Visual Studio 2015. Right? These are two different versions of ASP.NET that we released at the same time that behave very differently and have different capabilities. Now, what we called ASP.NET 5, we realized was such a departure from ASP.NET 4.6. It's not something you can just upgrade to. You can't just lift your code and drop it into the next version of the framework, or go into that combo box in project properties and say, well, now I'm targeting this version, and it just works. It's a lot different. There's a few more seats up here. Looks like there might be one or two over there. Defragment a little bit here, folks, so that people can still slide in. See, and those of you that have defragmented, you know what I'm talking about. I used to spend afternoons in the Penn State University computer labs just kicking off defrag on all the computers in the lab. That was my job for a while at college. Anyways, so we realized these were two different things, so we said ASP.NET 5 doesn't really describe what these things are. So we decided to rename it and rebrand it as ASP.NET Core. Okay, so if you hear people refer to ASP.NET 5, they're actually referring to ASP.NET Core, and there is no such thing as ASP.NET 5 anymore. Okay? So we changed the brand, we changed the numbering for it, because now it's actually ASP.NET Core 1.0, and that is a whole new thing, right? Something I don't recommend that you try to migrate your stuff from without expecting a little bit of headache, okay? It's different, there's different configuration happening there, but it can be done, all right? So we've got two different products that were released. ASP.NET 4.6, that's what we've known and loved for the past 15 years. ASP.NET Core 1.0 was just released RTM at the end of June, all right? And all of ASP.NET Core 1.0 is open source. Does that bother anybody? Is that a problem for anyone that we released ASP.NET Core as open source? Everybody's happy about ASP.NET Core as open source. Who cares about open source? Okay, cool. That's even more interesting. I mean, honestly, I've heard people say, well, the lawyers at my company, they don't like us using open source things because they feel that there's some sort of a problem there. We use open source stuff all the time. When you start Visual Studio, there are dozens of libraries that are in there that are open source that you're using all the time, okay? Don't be afraid of it. It's licensed and built to be permissible for you to package and redeploy your applications without having any of that concern around licensing. So ASP.NET Core 1.0, it's built on top of your choice of .NET Framework or .NET Core 1.0, which works on all three operating systems, right? Windows, Mac, Linux. We've got sessions coming up tomorrow and Sunday where we're going to show ASP.NET Core running on Mac and Linux. Very cool stuff. All of the libraries in .NET Core are open source, and all of our compilers and runtime components are all open source for this, right? So things like the Roslyn compiler, the Jitter, the languages are all open source now. And you can go out to GitHub, find the source code of those, change them, and make them suit your needs. And in fact, that's something that I'm going to do here in a demo in a little bit. Is we're going to take a look at how the framework works and change it up to suit our needs. So this is actually very important, and everybody kind of clear on these different pieces, because this is a deep dive. I want to make sure that I'm coming in at the right level for you guys. All right, I see some nodding heads. Good. There are 7 tenets, core design tenets around ASP.NET Core, all right? These are the things, when you see things that are different in ASP.NET Core compared to ASP.NET 4.6, those changes are because of these reasons, right? The big ones that everybody likes to point to are, of course, cross-platform, speed. Everybody wants their web application to run quickly, right? You don't want to have to do a lot of optimization just to get speed. It should be there out of the box. So we've done a lot on that. But I'm going to focus in this session, I'm going to focus on totally modular and seamless transition. Those are the two pieces that I want to make sure that you are a little bit familiar with here today. Now, my colleague John Galloway is going to get into some of these other things when he talks about front-end ASP.NET Core development a little bit later on in the conference. So, open source was a question that I kind of led here. There's an interesting question that comes around when you have open source, and that's about support. And we use the word support differently depending on whether you're referring to something that's open source or it's something you've paid Microsoft a support contract with, right? There's two different things there. So when we talk about support and you have support that you're paying a contract to Microsoft for, and you can use then the framework however you want, we have what are called long-term support and fast-track support, okay? Long-term support is what you get when you install a major release of ASP.NET Core. You can choose to use that for, I believe it's 3 years plus 1 year after a subsequent release that is a major release of ASP.NET Core. And then there's fast-track support for when we release those minor release versions, and you get support for, I believe it's an extra year or two when those versions come out and you update to those. There's all kinds of information about this at microsoft.com/net/core/support. And this is kind of one of those questions that people ask about open source stuff. Because in open source, they say, is this supported? They mean, can I do this? Is it possible for me to make this strange hack, right? Is it supported for me to build an ASP.NET Core application and host a website from my Apple Watch? It's supported. You can hack and do that. You can't come to us and say, oh, I rewrote the framework to use Apple Watch and it doesn't work. That's not something we built, but we've unblocked you. We've made it possible for you to target that framework if you want, right? Those weird, crazy things that are outside the box are supported. They're possible. It's up to you to figure out how to get there. And of course, when we talk about open source and we talk about Microsoft, of course, we know that the lawyers in Redmond are having a good time with us about this. Right, this is the common reaction. But in actuality, really, when the guys from our teams went to the lawyers and said, we want to be open source, they had the death stare. This is happening in a major way, okay? This is a big commitment from us, and we're making it happen, okay? Now, I've shown enough slides. I want to get into the actual code, some of the demos, and talk about how things are open source, how you can build your own framework, how you can use the tools anywhere, and how they're adaptable for any situation, okay? So let me go over to Visual Studio, because everything with .NET starts in Visual Studio. Or not. So I just want to point out one thing here. You know you've been working with Visual Studio too long when you have 5 of them installed. Okay? Who has 3 Visual Studios installed? Okay, I'm not strange with 5 of them. Who has 4? Okay, and then who has 5? So the 5 that I have installed are 2013, 2015. This is Visual Studio 15, which is not confusing at all to have 2015 and Visual Studio 15. This is Visual Studio Code. We know what Visual Studio Code is? Right, text-only editor based on Electron shell, all written in TypeScript. Source code for that is completely available. And this is the Canary builds. These are the nightly builds of Visual Studio Code, if you're just crazy enough to try something that's been built 12 hours ago. So otherwise, Visual Studio Code is actually released once a month. Okay, you'll get great updates in there. They're moving very fast and building some really neat stuff in Visual Studio Code. And we'll be using it exclusively in those cross-platform sessions later on in the conference. All right, so enough about Visual Studios. So let's start with, I'm going to start a new project, right? Because we've all seen, come on, Jeff. I've got like no room to move here, my mouse. We've all seen the new Project Dialog here, right? And we now have a web section that has very descriptively ASP.NET Web Application, ASP.NET Core Web Application, ASP.NET Core Web Application. That's not confusing at all. These are preview release bits. We are going to be changing this up. We have some ideas of how we want to simplify this. At one point, we just had one ASP.NET Web Application there. You would choose that, and then you could choose your framework. But the difference that's going on here is this is your classic, right, web forms, MVC, SignalR, Web API project that we've used for how many years now? These are the ASP.NET Core applications. This one is with that .NET Core cross-platform capable framework. This is the full .NET framework, so I can still use things that are Windows specific, like system configuration.configuration manager, right? If I've got a web config file out there, I can still use Configuration Manager to access those app settings inside this Windows version of the framework. Let me start a Windows version of the framework. You'll notice that this is Web Application 59. If anybody is trying to give you a demo on some of this stuff and that is not at least a double digit, they're lying to you. I rebuild my machine when that gets to 100. I wipe and reinstall Visual Studio. So let me start off by showing you a web application here, and I'm not even actually going to show you the web application because I'm assuming in this deep dive talk you've seen what the web application looks like. It's the typical Bootstrap website. That's not what I'm concerned about showing you. I want to show you a little bit under the scenes, behind the scenes, in Project JSON. Now, there's a little bit going on here with Project JSON over the next few months that I want to make sure everybody's aware of. Project JSON is the format that we use right now to define our ASP.NET Core applications. We have dependencies in there, we have information about the tools that are available to our application, the frameworks that are used, how we publish the application. Okay? Nice, easy, simpler to read and use than the old CS-Proj format. However, we are going to be migrating this format back into that CS-Proj MS Build project format that's XML based. Why? Because there's a whole lot of other project systems out there in .NET, okay? If you think about it, there's actually 7 different versions of .NET out there, between .NET Core, .NET Desktop Framework, Mono, Xamarin, Unity. Anybody playing Pokemon Go? That's all Unity. That's a .NET application. You may have seen the Unity splash screen come up sometimes when you start that game. That's a .NET application. And it's a different flavor of .NET than what you're using on ASP.NET Core, .NET Core, right? UWP, Silverlight, Windows Phone. These are all different flavors of the .NET framework. And if you've written a NuGet package, you know how painful it is to target these. I'm hearing some laughing over here because somebody has experienced the pain. We're trying to move away from that, okay? And Scott Hunter tomorrow afternoon is going to be talking about .NET in 2016 and what we're doing to get to one .NET framework and a .NET standard. So this is going to be simplified, adapted and moved into CS-Proj, and at that point we'll still have the same features that I'm going to talk about, but it'll be in a format that all of the project systems across all of those projects can use. So these dependencies we know are NuGet packages, right? And we know what NuGet is, right? It's our .NET package manager. Well, there's some interesting things in this version of Project JSON because we're using the Windows framework. And that's down here, we have frameworks net 462. This is saying very explicitly that we're using .NET 4.6.2, which is actually the release of the .NET framework that came out, I believe, a week and a half ago at the beginning of last week. And there's all kinds of new features in there for anniversary edition of Windows. So Net 4.6.2 is a Windows framework. This application won't recompile and run on Linux or Mac. If we look at a similar application, and you'll also notice there's a couple tools here, right? We know what the tools are. These are things that bolt on to the .NET command line. And then the dependencies, these are all just packages. The ones that are labeled build will not be deployed with our application, right? These are things that are used just at build time. And when we go to publish, the libraries and things that come with Razor tools will not go with us to our web application. Make sense? Okay. So let me back up and show you what an ASP.NET Core on .NET Core framework looks like. See, 60 now. So, and you know what? Let me turn on authentication just so I get a couple extra packages in here that are interesting. So let me come down to Project JSON. So I've now got things enabled for storing data in a database, right? So now we have Entity Framework Core that comes along, and we're going to point to and enable SQL Server. We've got design tools that are available, once again marked as build. These will not be included and deployed. There are Framework Core tools. That allows us to run .NET EF at the command line. We can take a look at that in a minute. And we've got a bunch more tools. Now, the interesting thing that I want you to see is this one right here. Type equals platform, right? What the heck? What's a package that's a type of platform? So we have this thing in Windows called the GAC, right? And every time I use that word GAC, I think of Nickelodeon. And I know some of you know what I'm talking about. Double Dare for the win. So if I come down into this folder, and I believe, where is it? It is, right, 4.0. I'm trying to think where exactly those DLLs are living. I can't remember off the top of my head. Temporary ASP.NET, is it here? No. No, don't move that. That would be bad. No, not that one. I can't remember which folder it is. But the actual DLLs for the .NET framework are living in here. Is it under assembly? Ah, there it is. Right, so here's all of the DLLs for running .NET 4.6.2 on Windows, right? And there's a mess of them in there. And I'm not going to zoom in on it so you can actually read these things because it doesn't matter what they are and because you don't care what they are. It's the .NET base class library and it's sitting here under Windows, Microsoft Net, blah, 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 blah. What happens when we have our .NET Core framework? Those packages actually come into this cprogramfiles.net folder. Wrong keystroke. There it is. Okay? And under here is actually where my .NET exe. This is the command line that I'll be using to compile and run my applications when I have a .NET Core application. Okay? This is the jump-off point to start applications. Now, this actually isn't even a real exe sitting here. It's a pointer to the real exe that is sitting under the SDK, and there is .NET DLL. It's actually running the contents of this file. Okay? So things that we did have in Windows are actually moved around, and we have our .NET Core framework here, and here's all the DLLs that are in the portable .NET Core framework, right? I mean, look at all these things. Right, there's .NET exe for this version of the framework, SystemNet, all these wonderful things, threading, where is it, Microsoft, C#, there's C#, okay? So these things live on Windows in this programfiles.net shared folder, okay? And it's just a bundle of DLLs that are living in some arbitrarily named folder. And we've laid these out appropriately because these are the things that we feel you need to build a base level .NET Core application. Now, that's nice, but when I go to build my applications for ASP.NET Core and .NET Core, I'm typically building something that's MVC with Razor bindings, right? Razor templates, maybe I've got Newtonsoft JSON in there, and I want to be able to use that same framework everywhere when I go to deploy, right? I really want to have my own Jeff's web framework. Makes sense. This way I can keep, I would want to be able to keep my list of dependencies in new web projects as small as possible. So this is actually something that you can do. You can build your own version of the GAC, right? That's not something you could do before, have your own, right, Microsoft.NET 4.6 point foo, right? You can't control what gets deployed. You're kind of locked in on the 4.6.2 version of the framework to having all these different things that you might not necessarily need when you spin up your web application. Have you ever looked in the debug stack when you're on IIS and you're debugging that web forms application or that MVC application, and you see things in there like XAML.designer? What the heck is that doing in there? All I'm doing on IIS is generating angle brackets and curly braces and sending it over the wire. But XAML loads up. System.drawing, WinForms, why are these things loading up? You pay a very big tax, memory tax, to load the BCL in IIS. That's a lot. So this is one of the things that comes in when we talk about running things in ASP.NET Core fast. We want you to opt into only those DLLs and libraries and dependencies that you need for your application. Because the more DLLs that you load, easy for me to say, the more memory you're using and the less performance that you're going to get out of your application, right? Get that stuff out of the way so you can build your application as robust as you need to. So let's take a look briefly. I have a command line here. I have this application over here. User secrets, user secrets is a way for us to hide configuration. But really, I want to focus on this platform thing. Let me go into this folder and into the folder for this application, and let's build it and see exactly what we get coming out of it. So this is under dev web application 60. And it's under, of course, a source folder. All right. Let me give us a little bit more room here. So now I'm on the command line. I can always use the .NET command. It's going to show me a bunch of information here, and it's wrapping badly for me. That's a little bit better. So this is version 1.0.1. The .NET command line interface is actually still in a preview release. Okay? There's more work being done on it, and we'll be at a final release here later in the fall, early in 2017. But it's suitable for all of our needs to build and work right now. So I can actually build and point to different framework versions. I can have it probe different paths. I want to actually just build my application the way that it lives right here, right now. So by executing .NET build, it'll go through, build my application, and come back and tell me that it built very quickly. If I execute .NET run, right, it builds my application if it needs to, and then it'll start running it. Why is it coming back and saying my hosting environment is production? Who knows what that is? Is that your build configuration? My build configuration by default is the production environment. If you don't tell it what environment you're building in, it'll think it's in production. And this is one of the features that you can use in your applications to either turn on or turn off different diagnostics capabilities. There's a build environment that you can configure. And when we build our application actually inside of Visual Studio, we would want to be in a development environment. We want it to know and give us capabilities that are appropriate for development, like debugging and diagnostic code. So Visual Studio, when you launch the debugger, sets this environment variable, ASP.NET Core _ environment, and it sets it to development. So by default, while your application is running, it thinks it's in development mode. But when you deploy to some other environment that isn't being hosted by Visual Studio, it's going to think by default that it's production unless you set that environment variable. So let's set that environment variable. Set ASP.NET Core environment equals development. That didn't come out right. There it goes. So now if I do .NET run, and now it tells me it's development, okay? Now, you can actually take a look and you can see by default inside of Startup CS, there are a number of places here where it says, if this is development, right? If this is development, then turn on the developer's exception page, turn on browser link, right? That's an editor capability for Visual Studio, and an error page appropriate for the database. And you can add your own settings in here to test if it's development or production and set things differently. But the key thing to pick up here is that I've set an environment variable and it affected my configuration. So, right, my configuration, I apply environment variables. It's my last thing that I do before configuration is set. So this is one of those things that are part of being able to deploy to the cloud easily, right? I can lift up my application, copy it out to some cloud location, and my operations team can set environment variables on that cloud host, and it'll apply to my application. But how do I narrow down that list of features in that framework? So let me show you how we can actually build our own framework. I'm kind of bouncing around here a little bit. Let me know if you have any questions. So if I wanted to have my own very simple shared framework so that everybody who needs to build a web application for my organization gets the same facilities of ASP.NET MVC, Razor, Newtonsoft JSON, I can come through here and I'm going to create a new, I'm actually going to create a .NET Core console application. And I'm going to name my framework something here. And let's call it the Code on the Beach framework, because that's a cool framework name, right? So it's going to create a new solution. That's fine. Now it's an empty exe that runs on .NET Core. And that's kind of important because when we're running on .NET Core on another environment like Mac or Linux, I don't have IIS over there. It doesn't know what to do with a DLL, so I need to have a command line exe, right? An executable that I can run on the command line, because the command line exists everywhere, over on Mac or Linux. But in this case, I still have a Project JSON file here, and it defines my version. So let's change my version name here from 1.0.0 to, what, it's Friday? It's, what day is today? The 12th. We'll call it Friday 12. That's the version number for our framework because, as we all know, version numbering is hard. Now, our dependencies, when you want to define a framework, it's referring initially to this platform here. And right, that's what it's going to refer to as the ASP.NET Core framework and point to. I don't want to do that because I'm defining a framework in this project. So I'm actually going to eliminate this, because I want to include the dependencies from Net Core app. And now I can start to add in those other things that I want to bundle with this as other package references. So let me add Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC, because I want to program with MVC 1.0, and Microsoft ASP.NET Core, and I love the type ahead here because, as you can see, I am an expert typist. I, of course, want Newtonsoft JSON, right? Because JSON is the new XML, and everybody uses JSON. I think that's enough. So I'm going to bring in everything that's in .NET Core. I'm going to bring in everything that's in MVC and Razor and JSON so that I can define a very easy framework that everybody's going to use when they want to build with the Code on the Beach 1.0.0 framework. Last thing that you need to do, because the .NET Core framework runs cross-platform, you actually need to tell it what runtimes you support. So I'm going to add a section here called runtimes, and I'm going to define Win7 x64. Now this is when you ask me, why is it Win7 x64 when you're clearly on Win10? Win7 just means it's backwards compatible on the Windows platforms all the way to 7, okay? So by referencing all of those things, I now have a framework that I can point to. Okay, and let me go down into source. So now if I build this, that's really low. I'm not actually in my folder. There it goes. Cool. So I've got that project built, but when I look in bin, debug, Net Core app, I've now got a DLL and a PDB sitting here. Even though I told it to build an exe, there's the exe, right? And it's also got some dependencies defined here. The next thing that you can do from the command line to start to bundle this up and make it available is executing the publish command. So what this is going to do is it's going to take all of those dependencies, pull them together as a series of DLLs, and put them in one folder for me. So this is everything that I need to run that project, okay? And you'll actually even see up here under C, there's my exe. So if I actually had something in my startup, I could run it here and it has all my DLLs in one place to run that project. So if you actually had to deploy this as one application, right, with all these DLLs, that's 50 meg. That's a lot, right? And that's why we have a GAC. That's why we have shared frameworks, so that I don't have to install that every time, right? You got your GAC updated by Windows Update. It happened overnight when Grandma wasn't looking. She got the latest version of the .NET framework, and now everything just works when you deploy your version of the .NET 4.6.2 application there, right? So we're going to do something similar in packaging this up and making it available so that when developers want to reference this, it knows where to go get it and deploy. And how do we package and make things available for .NET Core? NuGet packages. But somebody over here was groaning when I said, oh, NuGet packages. We've made it a bit easier. We've actually added on to the .NET command the pack command. It's true. So actually, before I pack that, I don't want to deploy these things because I'm not actually running them from my application. So I'm going to get rid of those. And now when I execute .NET pack, very quickly it comes through and it knows the dependencies, it knows the frameworks that I support in my application because they're in Project JSON. And .NET runtime, the .NET command line, knows how to read that and build up a NuGet package appropriately. Excuse me. So now, inside my publish folder, it still has the same contents. But if I back up, here's my runtime. Back up one more. There's my DLLs and things. I now have a NuGet package. Okay, and I have a NuGet package for all the symbols. So if I needed to debug, I can use that as well. But check out the name, right? Code on the Beach 100 Friday 12. Same as the version that I had coded in my Project JSON. Okay, so I've got a framework that's a package, and this is exactly how Microsoft bundles up and says, here's what's going to be in the .NET Core framework that we ship. Right? We just bundle it up into a NuGet package, and when you look inside the package, actually, and I think the spec is sitting here. I don't see it. It actually has pointers to, it actually doesn't have anything in it. It just has pointers to the different things it's referencing. So let me grab this, and I'm going to deploy it to my very handy-dandy local NuGet server, which happens to be a folder on disk. What is it? Not NuGet. I called it my NuGet repo, right? You guys know you can do this, right? You can put NuGet packages in a folder and then point to that and say, that's a NuGet repository, right? I do this all the time when I'm presenting, mostly because I'm paranoid about the internet connection inside of hotels. So that's why I've got like 9 versions of Newtonsoft JSON sitting here. So there's Code on the Beach 100 Friday NuGet package. Now, when I actually install that, it would, that's my, don't need that. It would copy down, and I'm going to cheat a little bit here. It would deploy that to my, here, yeah, that's right, that's the folder I wanted. To my shared folder, and you can see I've got some other ones that I've test deployed here. It would deploy it and have my framework deployed here. You don't need to do this. I'm only doing this to speed things along. So this would be the Code on the Beach framework, and it would have a folder name called 100 Friday, not Fritz. That's a great name for, but no. Right, it was Friday 12, was that the 100 Friday 12, okay. And the contents of that would be the same as what's over here. So let's just copy and paste. And I'm going to get access denied. Do it anyway. And it copies my files, big deal. But what this means now is I can actually go back into here. Let's start a new project. This time I'm going to create a web project. I'm going to create it with a .NET Core version of the framework, 61. I'm going to create an empty one. So, right, empty project has nothing that pops up except for hello world, right? That's how empty this is. It literally does nothing. You get to add in just those pieces you want. But I'm going to come into Project JSON, and instead of referencing Microsoft Net Core app, I can now reference code on the beach and my version that pops up here. 100 Friday 12. Visual Studio knows about my new framework. So let's choose that. And look, the only things that are being brought in at this point are diagnostics, Kestrel, and console. All right? Save that. And if I go over to startup now, right, I've added MVC into this, so I should services, add MVC. Okay? Now MVC is part of my framework, right? Now I've got everybody on the same version of MVC because they're using the same version of the framework that I created. And this is exactly what we do when we bundle up and version a framework. Okay? So MVC is now part of this. I'm not actually going to have it do anything with that. I'm just going to add it so that it's there. And this is Web Application 61. So let's go Web Application 61. Source, this one, .NET build, done, .NET run. Ah! Something didn't work. Why didn't it work? Could not load file or assembly, code on the beach, blah, 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 blah. What did I do?
Do you have to restore?
Did I restore? That's a good question. Did we do .NET Restore? Do we know about .NET Restore? .NET Restore, you have to restore packages, right? When you build a new application, we have these dependencies. Now, what I assumed was that Visual Studio automatically restored my packages for me. What I'm seeing here is that the log file has not changed. It's not actually the restore that it's missing. Could not load file or assembly. That's interesting. That makes me wonder. What do we want to do? How do we want to fix this? Or do we want to just skip? I'd hate to do that because I want to show you how cool it is that it works. That's where it landed, but I don't, is it because I didn't copy over code on the beach over here? Nope, it's there. Debug, NET Core app, Let me back up one here. I shouldn't have had to have copied these in here. Nope, not going to work for me. There's something I'm missing here, and I can't quite put my finger on it. What I do have, see, this is why I have other frameworks, test frameworks that I built earlier. I can go back over and I can show you how those ones, which were configured and did the exact same thing. So I called it test framework. And I called it 100 code on the beach. Now, see, it's restoring packages. That's what I thought was being done earlier. It's configured the exact same way. If I do .NET run now, that time it works. And it's actually dying somewhere down the line. Is it because I added this? Yep, that was it. Yeah. So if I go to localhost 5000 and I get hello world, right? So I've built my own version of the framework and I've deployed it and it's got just those pieces that I need for my consumers, for my other developers to use. And this is kind of important and something that I've heard a lot of folks want to do, especially around NuGet packages, right? They've got packages and versions of packages that they've blessed as these are the versions we use. Well, here's a way for you to define a framework and say, this is the web framework that we use. It is inherited from .NET Core, has these other features in it, and that's what we use. And then you can block access in your organization to NuGet.org, and people only use your version of the framework that you have hosted or stored locally. Make sense? Is that something you guys might use? This is something we're talking about possibly introducing as a way to trim resources, right? If you have other dependencies that you add to Project JSON here that you aren't using, maybe I don't want to use logging console. We're looking at, does it make sense then to trim and not include those extra dependencies when you go to build? Is that something you might find useful? Not deploying extra DLLs that aren't used. I'm seeing some nodding in the front, and I'm seeing some folks sweating in the back. I'm sorry?
I ran that similar problem that you were doing.
Yeah.
Just following this tutorial that's like, this is how you get things added in here. Because I had no idea. I didn't even know I was using .NET Core, to be honest.
Cool.
Just install Visual Studio, and it was just yelling at me. And I did, I can still add references. I can go there, and it's like, oh, that's nice. And then when you go click build, it's like, no, I don't like this. I don't know what this is. I don't like it.
Right, so we're trying to simplify that experience, make it easier, so that we eliminate the things that it doesn't understand. So that's a little bit about how the framework is built and is managed. Now, once I have an application built, I want to be able to push it out to the cloud. And the big question that folks I hear ask about is, I want to be able to push that application to a container, right? Who's using containers? Who's using Docker? Who doesn't know that Docker is actually a container? Okay. So, you don't know how. You've come to the right place. I've got about 15 minutes here, 15, 20 minutes. I'm going to go through and show you how we've tried to make this really easy to do. So this is the Nerd Dinner sample, right? You guys remember the Nerd Dinner sample from ASPNET MVC? Yes? Okay, I see a few people nodding. So this is a sample that we built a while ago that we've updated so that it's ready for the cool kids and the Angular generation. Follow with me for a second. This is running on ASP.NET Core, and it's running with Angular 1.5, I want to say. And, oh wow, look, you're upset at me. I know why that is. I know what that is. 1 second, I have my configuration set up here. Let's do this. So the thing that's interesting about .NET Core and ASP.NET Core and upgrading this application is that it was built to be run on Windows with ASP.NET on the GAC. We expect SQL Server to be there. But when you're running cross-platform, SQL Server is not running on localhost on Mac or Linux yet, right? We've all heard that announcement, that foretelling here that ASP.NET, that SQL Server is coming to Mac and Linux. So we need to run with a different database when we're on those environments. So I have this configured to run out of SQLite. And when we get finished publishing this sample, you'll be able to download it and it'll run SQLite on your machine. And it looks and feels very similar to the way it was running before, except this is all Angular, okay? So you can run Angular with its client-side router on top of ASP.NET with its server-side router. That isn't at all confusing. Because the first time you come in here and you try and figure out where dinners/detail is going to, and you realize there is no dinners controller. right? You then realize there is a dinners controller, but it's written in JavaScript, okay? That gets confusing. And the dinners controller in JavaScript is pointing to an API controller that's sitting server side. So now we've got two different controllers that have similar names. So we have this nerd dinner sample. Now, I mentioned we changed this so that it was running with SQLite. It's actually really easy to change how your application is connecting to a database. And I want to show this quickly here. We have Entity Framework sitting here, and I've referenced 3 different providers inside this project because I want to show you that we can pivot back and forth. I've referenced the SQLite provider, the SQL Server provider, and the Postgres provider. Postgres for the win? Yes? Okay, I see a couple people saying, all right. MySQL. Okay, and I hear an Oracle fan in the front. Okay, I've got 3 different versions of them listed, and I can reconfigure and point to them because changing database providers isn't something you do on an everyday basis, right? I mean, how many people lift up and change database? Frequently, if at all, right? We define and we add our provider as a service in ASP.NET Core, right? So we've added this into our dependency injection container so that it knows I'm using this provider to get to the entity framework for this DB context. Now, I've written a little bit of switch case statement in here to look inside my app settings and determine which connection string should I pull. All right, so that's me just changing things. But the interesting part here is you can use these services at Entity Framework, SQL Server, or add NPG SQL. That's the name of the current Postgres package that we use, NPG SQL, and we'll point to a Postgres connection. And then SQLite, and I just point to a file on disk, and it'll write that file on disk. So what's interesting about this is, let me come back to this one, and let me navigate to Nerd Dinner. So I know that's really small, and I'm going to apologize, but you don't really need to see it right now. There's my DB on disk. Let me delete that, and I'm going to rerun this application. That's really dark. And it's just easier for me to do that. So let me go to Nerd Dinner Web. And now if I say .NET Run, now check it out. It's scaffolding my application, scaffolding my database, right? Where'd it go? Come on now. That's not fair. No, I don't know where it scrolled because that's right there. That's not fair. There it is. So it's checking and making sure that my database is constructed. So it's written at this point my dinners DB to disk, and you could see 147. It just wrote it to disk. Okay, so it knows how to build out and structure things on disk for me, and I have that Postgres configuration out there. I don't care about Hello World. Now, what I want to show you about Postgres is I've actually got that living, where is it? Here it is. So I've actually got a Postgres local application. Now that's actually not, I don't have Postgres running here in my Windows 10 instance. I actually have Postgres running inside of Docker. So let me show you. I wrote a command to start up a Postgres image, which I've already downloaded, and it's sitting on this machine because I'm paranoid about the internet. And it's going to listen on port 5432. That's the Postgres port. And I've configured a highly secure password, so don't hack into it. And I've named my container DB. So let me run this. And it's going to tell me, why is it telling me that? That's interesting, because Docker isn't running right now. Well, that stinks. It's hard to run Docker samples when you don't have Docker running. There it is down there, starting up. Now, Docker on Windows actually runs inside of Hyper-V, right? So it starts up actually a Hyper-V image that's running Linux that we can connect to and stand up our containers inside of. So now, right, you guys know Docker containers images, you know what these things are? Can I do a 2-minute what they are real quick? Okay, so Docker images, it's a snapshot of what you want an application to run on your host machine as, okay? So it's got all kinds of information in there about the operating system that it's going to host within. It's got information about the application, the configuration as far as environment variables, and all the files that it's going to stick inside this virtual machine for you. There it is, it's now running. Now I can run Docker. Now, that's what an image is. It's a snapshot of this. Well, I can now run copies of that, right? Have you ever wanted to stand up like 5 copies of your website very quickly? And it's a pain in the neck to spin up new VMs and give them from one VHD and give them new IP addresses and all that stuff, right? Have you tried to do that on Azure and take the number from 1 to like 5 instances of your web application, right? It's just a slider, so it's like, no problem. I want 5 of those. But you end up waiting like 20 minutes for all the VMs to start, right? Wouldn't it be great if our application would start up in a brand new container like that? I've now got a database running called Postgres. And now I can come over here and change this and tell it I want to run the Postgres version. Just to prove to you that this is actually running here, I'm going to run Docker logs against my DB with a follow. So you can see there it is running. Let me come back to Visual Studio. Let's run this. So I'm going to get a new version. And we should see, it's not going to show me in my log. But this stuff is actually coming from Postgres now. It's coming from this database over here on the side. Okay? So I've stood up an application and I'm pointing to a container. That's nice, but what happens when I really want to lift up, I want to take my entire application and move it to the cloud and have it in a container living next to that database. Because now I can have 2 containers that are very portable, right? And I get away from that whole thing with my QA department where it works on my machine, because I can just give them a container that is quite literally a snapshot of the application as I left it. So let's do that. So I've actually already built my nerd dinner image, and it is sitting here, this one, debug. So let me start that one. Because we can, and actually I should show you how the tooling supports this. You can right-click on your project in Visual Studio, and to get this ready for Docker, it's under Add, which is kind of weird because you're adding new things to your project, but adding Docker support is here. So when you have the Docker tools for Visual Studio installed, which I believe comes by default with Update 3. If it doesn't, look for it under the extensions. You'll find it up there. But Docker support, and it'll add these Docker files, like this one, that very clearly says we're going to inherit from the Microsoft .NET Core image, define an app folder, listen on port 80, right? We set this ASP.NET Core URLs, right? There's another environment variable configuration point, ASP.NET Core _ URLs. We're listening on port 80, and then expose 80, right? That's how we tell Docker, punch a hole in the Docker firewall so that the host machine can see port 80. And then we just copy the contents from our host machine to the app folder inside of my Docker image. And then I'm going to start the application. That's what this entry point command is, by calling .NET and then pass in the DLL. Right? When I don't have a project JSON I'm pointing to, and I want to run an application from the .NET command, I give it a DLL or an exe name, and it'll run that. Okay? So that's how it's going to launch my container. Let's make sure I have. Let's see if I can get this launched, if I remember the commands properly. So -IT is interactive with a terminal so that it's actually sitting there listening. D is detached or run in daemon mode, right? Background process. Don't terminate after I press enter here. I'm going to run, I want to name this. Let's call this dub. I want to expose a port. The internal port that I'm going to expose is port 80. So I want to map port 80 through the firewall and to my host port of 80. I called this dub, and I need to link to that Postgres machine that we called DB. And I think A60 is the identifier for this. Oh, I got to call run. My bad. Could not get, I have these backwards. Postgres. There it is. So now my application is running inside of a container, right? That's a web application running there, right? Docker logs -f. Oh no. It didn't run properly. Bummer. What do I want to do here? Oh. Hang on. I know what I did. Let me get rid of that one. I actually created this one right here, nerddinner-web. That's the one I wanted to reference. Now it's running, okay? You see the same log information that I saw before. It's checking and populating my Postgres database. It's running in production mode on port 80. So now if I come back, I don't have a browser. Yes, I'm using Firefox and I'm a Microsoft person. Localhost. Now there's my application running from a container connecting to another container that hosts my database. But it's running in production mode. What if I don't want to run in production mode? And you can see there, right, there's my requests that it received. What if I don't want to run in production mode? I can shut down that container. Where'd it go? I had it. Yep. Right, it stopped and it deallocated my container. I can come through and I can also say, I can provide an environment variable here. Right, and what was my environment variable to set my environment? ASPNET core environment equals development. Spell it right. He needs this for the birdie. Up and running. Still coming online. There it is. So this is why it's important for us to be able to push content into, where is it? I'm looking for the started as development mode. There it is, development. See it? So this is why it's important for us to be able to push configuration as environment variables into our Docker containers and into our application and be able to detect them. Because when somebody's starting a container, they can push environment variables into that to configure for you. And a container, we want to be really, really small. So when you look at the images here, that Nerd Dinner web is only 279 meg. Fantastic. Because that means I can spin up more of these and push them to other machines without taking up a lot of space and waiting for a lot of download time, okay? So, I've covered a lot here. We've looked at our own framework. We've looked at slimming down and giving us just the pieces we need. We've run a lot from the command line. And I want to make sure that that's very clear to all of you, is that the command line is a first-class experience with ASP.NET Core and .NET Core. Everything can be done from the command line, and as you'll see at the other sessions later on at the show, there is a lot on those other environments that we do at the command line. Let me give you some references for those other sessions, people that are going to be talking about this. So Secure ASP.NET Core Apps with Cecil Phillip is here next. right? ASP.NET Core front end, John Galloway is going to be talking about that at 3:30 today. And then Jason Verard is going to be talking about code to container. Not specifically about ASP.NET Core, but more about containers and how they work for developers. I really encourage you to come to the 2 sessions tomorrow, 4 and 5:15 on the schedule for C#6, C#7. Right now, C#6 is the version of C# that's available for ASP.NET Core. C#7 will be coming along with the next version that we're going to be releasing with VS15. I think there's a C#7 session also planned?
5:15
at
C#7.
At 5:15? There we go. And Scott Hunter. Scott Hunter is actually the program manager who's in charge of all of .NET, okay? I encourage you, if you have any interest outside of ASP.NET, Xamarin, WPF types of things, F#, C#, VB, check out Scott Hunter's session tomorrow. And if you're really in C# and C#7, you want to see what's coming down the line, Kathleen has some great stuff about that tomorrow as well. If you wanted more of an intro to this, I know I went deep on stuff. Scott's going to talk about the intro to ASP.NET, really go shallow and cover a lot of different things at 8 o'clock. And then I'll show you ASP.NET on Linux, but really a Mac. Because unless you're really uptight about that kind of thing, they're close enough. And then John Galloway is going to talk about a lot of cross-platform stuff at 10:30 in the closing keynote. I'll leave you with some links. Go get a copy of .NET at .NET, if that doesn't sound like I'm stuttering. Either that or playing Pac-Man. ASP.NET is our community site, web dev blog at blogsmsdn.com/webdev, NuGet.org, you're probably familiar with. Docs ASP.NET, we're doing a lot with our documentation. This is open source, the documentation for ASP.NET. So if you get into and you really know some of this stuff and you want to contribute and see your name out there with ASP.NET as a known expert, you can contribute to our documentation at docs.asp.net. And I've been mentioning this is open source. GitHub.com/ASP.NET is where all of this stuff starts at. And I would be amiss if I didn't direct you to check out the community stand-up at live.asp.net. The program managers for the entire framework, they answer your questions there every Tuesday and talk about the cool things that are happening as we progress towards the next version. My name is Jeff Fritz. You can find me on Twitter at C#Fritz. Thanks a lot.